Hello, my name is David Inoue, and I'm the Executive Director for the Japanese American Citizens League. Today it's my privilege to bring to you our contribution to Tadaima, a virtual pilgrimage. Today we're going to share a little bit of the history of JACL, our over 90 years of existence, and the role that we have played in both the Japanese American community and in our country's history as well. We're going to start off with a brief video, a little teaser of another project that we're working on called League of Dreams, to bring the full history of the JACL to the screen. We're going to follow that up with a discussion with Floyd Mori, former president and executive director for JACL, and Jeffrey Moy, our current president. It will be moderated by Sarah Baker, our current VP of Public Affairs. I hope you'll enjoy the program and learn a little bit about what JACL does, has done, and what we hope to do in the future. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to working with you as we continue in our fight for civil rights in this country. Thank you.
Asian immigration to the United States began in the 1850s with the California Gold Rush, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, sugarcane and pineapple plantations in Hawaii. Japanese farms, fishermen, canneries emerged up and down the West Coast, along with the bustling Japan towns and Chinatowns. And as immigration grew, so did the rise of hate.
You know, you see a group of people and they're being successful and they just came off, the boat. How is it this, they have a house, they have a car, they're doing well, nice fancy Western clothes. How does that happen? And then the other side of the fence. And it happens everywhere, and it happens with all classes of people.
Anti-Japanese sentiment was fueled by organizations like the Japanese Exclusion League, the California State Grange, and the Native Sons of the Golden West, who referred to these new immigrants as the Yellow Peril and the Asian Horde.
Injustices to Japanese Americans didn't just start in 1941. That was just the culmination of all this fear.
The Japanese American Citizens League has a long history in the United States, founded in 1929, and much of the leadership of the JACL were young Nisei Japanese Americans who were in their early 30s. That's an awfully young age to be leading a community. And certainly the issues that the JACL has always focused on are issues of equality, issues of inclusion here in the United States.
But it was about providing services for our own community members that were not available outside of our own community because of institutionalized racism and practices.
The JACL was an organization that championed a lot of legal issues too. The Alien Land Law Act, anti-miscegenation laws, being able to outmarry.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Within 8 days after Pearl Harbor, the FBI picked up 2,192 Japanese and Japanese Americans, many of whom were members of the JACL.
It's very clear that what the U.S. did with 9066 was truly an injustice at a strike of a pen.
After the order came down for them to be excluded from the West Coast, from California, they were sent to Santa Anita Racetrack. They had to live in horse stalls. There was horse manure on the walls, hay on the ground. They had a 1-year-old child. My grandmother was with them.
They lived in a stable. I think she found that to be the most embarrassing and appalling for someone who had done nothing wrong.
They were then transported across the country. They didn't know where though they were going. They didn't know how long they were going to be in prison. They ended up in Rohr, Arkansas. It was a swampland.
We ended up at Manzanar.
They were in Poston, Arizona.
And they were placed in Gila River.
We went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. That was our home for the duration of World War II.
It was totally unprecedented that they would have no due process for a group of people just because of the color of their skin.
Obviously, if you got interned, you're going to get your property repossessed. You're going to get your car taken away.
So they lost everything they had.
The JACL argued for and won the right of Japanese Americans to serve in the U.S. military, resulting in the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which joined the 100th Battalion from Hawaii and became the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military history. When the war finally ended, the JACL assisted families as they left the government camps and helping them resettle back to the West Coast and the Midwest.
JCL really set the course for what is good negotiations. We have to be, as they say, you're either at the table or you're on the table. So I think JCL's position is that they want to be at the table.
But they always had a battle, and that's good. So it taught us to, fight for what you believe in.
Martin Luther King, March on Washington, Selma, Lovings versus Virginia. JCL was there. People need to understand that JCL is an active participant. Bill Martatani was actually at the court cases being able to argue Lovings versus Virginia.
The 1978 convention of the National JCL, they passed a resolution saying that they were going to seek an apology from the Congress.
The JCL met with Senator Danny Noah. Senator Noah's idea was, no, you've got to prime the pump. You've got to educate America first.
Legislation is really sometimes the aligning of the stars. You could not have had a better all-star crew than that. That was the A-team.
You have to mention Sparky Matsunaga. He knocked on the door of every congressman.
Bob Matsui was another hero. Guys that could really get stuff done. Of course, there was the Godfather, Inoue. He was kind of like the general behind the scenes.
And it was his direction and advice that the commission be formed.
I remember seeing Norm Mineta and Bob Matsui on C-SPAN arguing for redress, crying, talking about their stories, about how their families were taken away, what they lost. And I thought, these are men who are just fairly new to Congress. Essentially, they were risking their entire political career.
I was able to see what a small group of people could really do if we had justice on our side.
We look at English as second language, gay rights, equal wages, women's rights. You look at the issue of same-sex marriage. JCL was the first national organization to support that concept.
The JCL is also an entity that can deal with civil rights issues, social injustice issues on a county and citywide and a statewide and national scope.
You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane has crashed into...
Right after 9/11, we put out a statement about how terrible it was, but let's not forget people's due process. It was very gratifying to hear President Bush. Let's not let happen to the Arab Americans what happened to Norm in 1941.
JCL called Muslim and Arab groups and said, we're behind you. And it was a wonderful fulfillment of the legacy of redress, that we could stand up and we could support a besieged minority group, a marginalized group, because of our own experience. We came away from the darkness of the incarceration into the sunlight of redress, and we came with a voice again. We had a political voice. We came with our political birthright. We came with understanding that we have the right to dissent. We have the right to stand up.
To stand up and say, we're not going to allow this to happen again in the 2000s. JCL understands America's promise. The promise that in our nation, an individual is not to be judged by the color of their skin, by the nation of their origin, or by the God whom they choose to worship.
Thomas Jefferson said, a country that chooses security over liberty deserves neither.
I've said that to my own kids, that when you see injustice, if you can do something about it, it's important that you do. Because if you don't, no one else will.
The Japanese American Citizens League is considered the oldest Asian Pacific American civil rights organization. As I recall, the motto of the JCL is for better security through unity. And the other phrase of being a better American in a greater America.
All right. How is everybody?
Good, how are you?
Good. Floyd, how about you?
We're doing fine, all cooped up in our house.
I know. It feels strange that we can't all meet in person, but all right.
But you've been golfing, haven't you?
A little bit.
I know you're not that cooped up.
All right. I'll go ahead and jump in with the first question, if that sounds good to you all.
Go for it.
Great. All right. How was the founding of JACL in reaction or response to the early discrimination and xenophobia faced by Japanese Americans? And how does the discrimination of that time parallel discrimination that we sometimes see today? So examples might be with the American Muslim community, with immigrants, with the current COVID-19 situation.
Maybe I can start off a little bit. We have to go back over 100 years when we had anti-Asian feelings very late in the 1800s. And that was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But then we go to the early 1900s when basically the American government made the same kind of agreement with Japan to not allow immigrants, workers from Japan. And that was finally made into law in 1924. So you look at pre-World War II, and there's considerable anti-Asian, particularly in California, a lot of anti-Japanese feeling because the Japanese were becoming significant in business and agriculture and other areas. And there were even organizations that were against Japanese being involved in society. So it was a very strong feeling at that time.
Yeah, and just to, I guess, add to that a little bit, I mean, obviously in the U.S., we do have, a legacy of racism in this country against different groups. I think often it's whoever the newest immigrant group is the one that gets targeted the most. And so, what we saw happen to Japanese Americans, as you alluded to, Sarah, we saw in the wake of 9/11 anti-Muslim and anti-Arab discrimination. We've continued to see, anti-Latino discrimination, particularly with regard to Mexican immigrants or other immigrants from South or Central America trying to come here. And with COVID-19, we see anti-Chinese sentiment, which impacts Asian Americans broadly, right? In the same way that Vincent Chin was murdered in the 1980s, right? Even though the people who killed him they really had anti-Japanese sentiment. It didn't matter that he was Chinese American and he was the one who was murdered. So, we see this pattern over and over throughout history. So I think those are, in some ways, it's easy to understand the circumstances with which the JACL was founded because we continue to face these issues today.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well seeing these rhetorics repeat themselves, because I think a lot of what it is this assumption that these communities are monolithic, right? And that when you actually disaggregate the data, that you're looking at like really nuanced and subtle differences in some ways that people just kind of smooth over into being like, oh, all Asians must have COVID, right? And that this is a problem, or that all Muslims are the same and they're all trying to be terrorists. And it's like, it's a very small subsection in some cases, or not at all. And these are just myths that are being created as a way to scare people. But then it's just propagated over and over and over again. It's really interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all aware of the perpetual foreigner myth, right? Like this stereotype that Asian Americans, no matter how long we've been here, how many generations our families have been here, we still get asked, where are you from, right? I'm a Yonsei, I'm fourth generation, people still will come up to me and ask me, where are you from? And I'll say, well, I was born and raised in Maryland.
But where are you really from, Jeff?
Right, exactly. And then it's always, where are you really from? And, that's when I try to engage in a conversation around, well, if you're asking me about, my ethnic background, then I guess, my family's original country of origin is this. But, I think these things are so ingrained in society, it can be really difficult to go through that education process with folks.
Why do you speak English so well?
Right.
Where did you learn to speak so well?
Right. And especially when our government often are the folks that are disseminating this types of information, right? And so thinking about the caricatures that we had seen in the past, right, of Japanese Americans, like the drawings that were historically done by Dr. Seuss as an example, and thinking about, the caricatures that we see of Muslims as terrorists and that kind of stuff, the things that Trump has said about immigrants. It just paints this picture. And because it is, our government, our leaders that are saying some of these things, that becomes the dominant narrative, which is really scary.
Yeah, you talk about caricatures, and you guys are a little young, but I remember World War II and the depiction of Japanese soldiers with buck teeth and very ugly, sinister type people. So as a child, and I can imagine how children of new immigrants feel. As a child, it was very alarming, and when I went to school, I was somewhat ashamed of who I was because of the way it was depicted in the media. And I'm sure today, with the media as broad as it is, and young people and children seeing and hearing the things that some of our leaders are saying about immigrants, there has to be a major mental, psychological impact upon minorities today.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to move to the second question, if that's okay with you all. Cool. How did the JACL take on a leadership role during the war? Discuss decisions made by JACL with regard to strategy, and how was the view of those decisions changed over time?
I imagine you're referring to World War II when you say war. The JACL was a young fledgling organization that was organized by actually some very young people. We're coming back to that era because we have a lot of young people in the leadership today. But it was the only organization that had national prominence. And being the only organization, it had a very strong leader, Mike Masaoka, who didn't shy away from saying what he thought or what ought to be done. And that together with, I think, a mentality of being suppressed for decades in the United States, there was not always a feeling of cohesion among that generation of Japanese Americans. I think some felt that we should not concede as we did during that time and allow them without any demonstrations to take us to those concentration camps. But, being a child of that era, I think that the culture of most Japanese families was that, to comply and to do what they could to not make waves and to show that they are willing to cooperate. So JACL came up during a very difficult time and had to make some very difficult decisions, but it was not smooth. There was opposition and there was some divisions within the community itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just in the way that the API community is not a monolith, trying to pretend like the Japanese American community is a monolith is crazy too, right? I mean, we have folks from multiple, especially now, we have folks from multiple generations, people who are Shinnikke, right? I mean, we're very diverse in our all kinds of views, right? Political or otherwise. So, when I think about when I think about the history of the JCL, when I think about actions taken during World War II, you know, what's really important for me now is really seeing what we can do to acknowledge everyone's stories and making sure that that's included in the history. You know, that's why obviously last year when we passed at convention the resolution around apologizing to Tule Lake resistors, I thought that was a really important moment for us as a community, as a broader community, right? To understand that there were multiple views, and I certainly, as someone who was not alive during World War II, I can't imagine what that was like. You know, I can't imagine how horrific it must have been during that time to endure that amount of racism, to be, you know, to not know if you were going to, you know, lose your home, be deported. You know, nobody knew what was coming, right, or what the military was going to do to the Japanese American community. So, you know, tough choices were made, tough decisions were made, and I think now it's important for us to acknowledge that deeply traumatic event in our history, and to try to do what we can to process it together, because it does impact, you know, the generations that have come after, right? These are things that I was never really able to talk to my grandmother about her experience at Hart Mountain because she just more or less refuses to talk about it. And I remember as well as, you know, as a little kid, I took Japanese lessons. I always wanted to practice with her, and she refused to speak in anything but English. So when I think about that amount of trauma, and the inability, you know, for a lot of sanseis, and again, even yonseis like myself, to really have conversations in our families about it, it's clear to me that we have a lot of work to do to reflect upon the decisions that were made during World War II.
Yeah, you know, when I was the national director, 10 years ago or so, I went on one of those pilgrimages that went to Tule Lake. And at that time, in the mid, 2000s, it was probably around 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. I was the first JACL official that went to Tule Lake on a Tule Lake pilgrimage. So, there were institutional barriers at times too, for and within JACL, that I think today we are more open, more willing to work with other people, which is good. We are not the only organization, but we are learning to collaborate and work with other organizations, not just Japanese American organizations, but other Asian organizations, as well as other civil rights organizations. This is something that we did not have as we go back to World War II. There was nobody there to support or sympathize with what happened to Japanese Americans. Probably the major organization was the Quakers, who saw a need to allow Japanese to come and live with them. But I think we've moved into a new era of collaboration and cooperation to have a stronger voice in what's going on in this anti-Asian feeling in the country.
And actually, that's a really good segue into the next question, which is, with the resurgence of national concern for Black Lives Matter, what role did the JACL play in the early civil rights movement with the March on Washington, creation of the Leadership Conference, et cetera, and more recently in support of gay marriage? So thinking about some of the controversy that's developed within our organization around those positions, but also, thinking about the coalitions that we've been able to build as a result.
Yeah, I remember the convention here in Salt Lake City in 1994 when JACL was the first national organization to come out in support of gay marriage. And that was unheard of and within JACL, very controversial, but then I think a very major step in stepping out and showing that we support others. During the 9/11, the same thing. We spoke out immediately to not let happen to Muslims as what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. So I think we've had the opportunity And now we are stepping out and moving into new issues. Black Lives Matter was an issue that was brought to the convention by some of maybe you, Jeff, some of the young people at that time, to a JACL convention. And it was somewhat controversial within JACL, but you know, I went to the Black Lives Matter protest here in Salt Lake City last week, and it was very peaceful, very reasonable, very organized, and had the support of many different people. So, you know, organizations mature, and Black Lives Matter, I think, is matured into an organization that is going to be helpful in this civil rights organization. In fact, the youth of Utah are going to have a workshop with the leader of Black Lives Matter to learn more about their strategy and how we can work more closely with them. I think we need to do more of this.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything you're saying, Floyd. I mean, I think one thing that I keep thinking about, you know, as you've asked these questions and we've been talking is, you know, it makes, you know, I think when the JA population was, you know, sort of the newer immigrant group to this country, and there weren't services available, right, for our community, it makes sense that something like the JACL would be formed to serve those needs, right, and look and be a little bit more insular in that way, right? But now that we have a history of being in this country and fighting for civil rights throughout this time, it makes sense that as this organization, you know, continues on and matures, that we would do more to reach out to other communities, because we know what that's like, right? We know what it's like to be in those tough positions, to not have folks reaching out to our community. And so now we have to be there in those fights and struggles with others. I think, I mean, yeah, with regard to Black Lives Matter, I mean, it's really been incredible to see the surge of folks out on the streets. I mean, I recognize the bubble that I live in here in San Francisco now, but you know, the marches and rallies out here have just had incredible amounts of people. Obviously, folks of all, you know, races and ethnicities, at least as far as I could see visibly. And yeah, everything has just been, there's just such a clear need to do more. And I think everyone is feeling that right now. And yeah, some of these decisions are going to be difficult or controversial for our membership. I get that. But my hope is also that, you know, Floyd, you know, you were referencing things in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And my hope would be every time we have a difficult discussion like that at our conventions, the next one gets a little bit easier. You know, the next time a topic comes up that people might say, but that's what impact does that really have on us? We won't have to answer that question as much, right? Because our members should understand, based on the actions this organization has taken over time, that, you know, our struggle is intertwined with you know, the struggles of all communities of color or all disenfranchised communities.
Yeah, you know, I think we have a lot to learn from the redress movement, because during that time, JACL members and chapters really got out in the grassroots and became acquainted with their members of Congress, and it was easy for them they became friends, and it was easy for them to talk to them and for members of Congress to respond. I think we've kind of gotten out of that mode. We need to get back into that mode, because we have some things coming up that we need to be involved in. I remember back in the 70s when I was in the state assembly, my colleagues in the assembly, when an issue came up, would always come to me and say, what is the JACL position on this? They wanted to know what the community felt. So we've got to let our feelings known and what our positions are more loudly than we've kind of been cruising along now. The redress passed, we got the gold medal. Now we've been kind of cruising. Now there's some critical things that we need to get engaged in.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of precedents to support Black Lives Matter and the Black community in the struggle that they're going through, because we've achieved redress, right? Because we've, as Jeff was saying, have been there, and that we were able to achieve this thing. You know, we owe a lot to the Black community through the civil rights movement, right? They have been with us and have been leading this entire time. And so it's time for us to turn around and say, like, we support you, we've got your backs. And thinking about redress, actually, because, you know, it was such a big movement for the JACL, and Floyd, you just mentioned that, you know, we've kind of been cruising since then. You know, how did redress really bring the JACL and other members of the Japanese American community together? And what role did our allies play in achieving redress?
Well, I think we began to talk about it rather than just think about it. We came out of our shells and we really began to understand what it was. And the Sansei, Yonsei saw the injustice and were very vocal and began to talk about it. And then the Nisei kind of let their feelings out also. So I think we need to begin within our chapters, within our districts, begin to talk about it more. I think this is why the pilgrimages are very important. As we re-examine and reassess, and not just the people that were in camps, but young people like you get engaged and involved by understanding what it was all about and seeing what it was all about. I think you know, this is the one reason we're getting our youth together with Black Lives Matter leaders here in Utah, is that this is something that they normally wouldn't do. And it's become a very major issue, and they want to find out, they want to understand, so they can support it more solidly, and maybe go out and do some demonstrations. And in fact, they've talked about doing that as an organization. Now, Utah's a conservative place too, a very conservative state. It was interesting that this past weekend, there was a protest march in the suburbs, way out in the suburbs of Salt Lake City. Large group of in a community out there that went out in support of Black Lives Matter. It's very heartwarming.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think about is really just how important it is to connect with other communities on a personal level, right? And just have conversations with each other and really hear each other. You know, I think about, you know, post 9/11, JACL had the Bridging Communities program, which was a program essentially to bring JA youth and Muslim American or Arab American youth together to share those perspectives and really understand the parallels in our community's histories. And I think, you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier about, you know, the racism that we see in this country, the questions that we get asked about, you know, where we're really from, things like that. A lot of that comes from just a lack of understanding, right? I mean, even for myself, where I grew up, there just weren't a lot of Asian Americans. And so, you know, I would get a lot of those ignorant questions. But to some extent, I could understand that lack of exposure was an issue, right? And so when I think about anti-Blackness in the Asian American community, it makes me wonder how many, you know, person-to-person conversations are really happening between Asian Americans and Black folks, you know, because I think that's just so critical. And yeah, hopefully there are some lessons that our community learned through redress that we could share that may be helpful in, you know, any further attempts at, or, you know, at reparations. But I think, you know, obviously there's a lot that Asian Americans need to sit back and learn from the Black community as well.
Yeah, and how do you see, I guess, like, how redress can serve as a model for achieving those reparations for the Black community. I mean, it's such a big, right, it's such a big thing to think about, but I think, again, that there really is a precedence there. I also see that as being like a very intergenerational thing that we can use to bring communities together. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the concept is valid. It's a little different in terms of practicality and operation, in that it's been centuries now for slavery, and generations. Who are generations of slavery? The reparations issues. I had a discussion with a famous professor at Harvard regarding reparations. Probably it's been about 20 years ago at a ABA conference, and it was talked about then, but the reality of trying to do something that was similar to Japanese American reparations may be realistically difficult to do. But the concept, I think, is very real. I mean, they're treated like slaves today by certain people and certain organizations. So I think the concept is very true.
Yeah, I would just add that I think one of the things that I think about when I think about redress is really the opportunity for stories to be heard, the Japanese American stories to be heard. And I think we need to find ways to make space for that kind of thing in our society. And so, I mean, people talk about, truth and reconciliation and healing work, right? And so I think that is sort of my hope, that we can see spaces opened up for those types of healing conversations and for people to really hear about each other's experience in a deep way. I mean, I think that's a big part of why we're seeing so much energy around the movement for Black lives currently, right? I mean, you can't avoid the videos, right? The videos that have been taken of police officers, murdering Black people. That's something that is just a new reality in terms of technology, right? I mean, I think many of us understood that these things were happening, but now some people who perhaps were, I don't know, in denial, or just, I don't know what the case may be, but you're just confronted with the objective fact that this is what's happening, right? And so there have to be other ways that we can continue to raise awareness, raise our own awareness, raise other people's awareness about the things that are going on.
Yeah, and I think too, you mentioned earlier anti-Blackness in Asian communities, right? And thinking about how we've been complicit in anti-Blackness, either through, direct racism or even through our own silence and what that looks like. And so again, I think that it's really important for Asian Americans and Japanese Americans specifically to kind of look at that at ourselves internally and seeing how we can undo those systems of oppression, right? And addressing things like our own proximity to whiteness and how we buy into the model minority myth. And so how do we dismantle those things, and in so doing help to uplift the Black community, right? How do we do things like supporting HR 40 that can really give Black folks more voice and more power while simultaneously, supporting all communities of color?
Absolutely, yeah. It's of course it was the Blacks are out front today, but before the not the Rodney King, but Floyd, I can remember that name. Before the Floyd incident, the anti-Asian American stuff that was occurring. It's just, as Jeff says, you see these videos today, and it's just unimaginable how people have that much hate and whatever it is towards somebody that doesn't look like them. And it still exists in a very real way. And so I think we, as an organization, have to really step up. As we've gone through it, we've not totally overcome it, but we've done, we've made progress. And I hope that progress can be used to help other communities that are facing right now today the same kinds of issues that were faced in 1941 and before.
Right. All right. Well, that's all the questions that I have. Do either of you want to add anything, or?
I guess, just kind of a last thought jumping off what Floyd just said. I think, again, yeah, we have a responsibility as an organization to have these difficult conversations, right? Even though it's going to be uncomfortable, even though it'll probably lead to some heated debates at the next convention or whenever that occurs. We have to keep pushing, again, keep listening, keep educating ourselves, educating each other on these issues, because it's the only way we're going to be able to achieve the kind of equitable society, that we hope for. So I know it's difficult, it can be exhausting, but it's why we exist, literally, right, as an organization. So we've got to keep doing the work and trying to move things forward.
As you mentioned, this last convention, the resistors of Tule Lake were recognized. For many decades, there was a very major division within the community because of the so-called resistors. We did that resolution back in the early 2000s for the Resistors of Conscience. And we had a ceremony, and it was just heart-warming to have the resistors there in person, where there was not a good feeling in the past that JACL had probably caused some of the stigma that existed within the resistors community. But now we understand it more. We've reached out, and that whole term together has become very, very important to our community. And we need to do the same thing as we look at Black Lives Matter, other Asians, other religions that are being persecuted today. We're all one, my feeling, in the eyes of God. And let's respect our fellow human beings and to work on their behalf strongly when we see injustice occur. We've experienced it. We know what it's like.
Well, thank you both for joining today and for sharing your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Jeff.